Bona tarda, benvinguts i benvingudes. Welcome everyone who is following us live or recorded on ACCA's YouTube channel. We are very excited to continue today with this series of seminars as a part of the program When Affection Becomes Care, a program which has been running for months through a series of newsletters in which we have had a wide and stimulating collaboration. Thanks once again to all those who have contributed to them. In the last seminar, both Rock and I introduced the aim of this program on affective care and the policies of care, which is analyzing the cultural practices and strategies that contribute to sustain the artistic network, as well to involve in contemporary art often unrepresented groups. Likewise, our intention is also bringing together the plurality of contributions on policies of care that exist in different directions. Because this is important for us, we didn't want to approach this concern from the logic of consensus, but from a debate. So it wouldn't therefore be a question of just celebrating affections, but of asking ourselves what affection, what care, who cares, and why they care. For this reason, we will have both Beatrice von Bismarck and Bonaventure Ndikung among us today, whom we really appreciate for joining us. This session will address to the policies of care from the criticism and curatorial practice approach. I would just like to inform that such session will consist of a brief presentation of about 30 minutes by each guest, followed by a debate of around 30 minutes more, when everyone will be able to send us any questions or comments on the chat enabled on the same YouTube platform. Okay, so with further ado, I welcome Beatrice von Bismarck. Beatrice von Bismarck is an art historian, curator, and professor of art history, visual culture, and curatorial cultures at the Academy of Visual Art in Leipzig. She was the main curator of the 20th century art at the Cultures Museum in Frankfurt in the 90s. She was then co-founder and director of the project space Kunstraum der Universität at Lüneburg. She's also a co-founder of the project space DOC, Project Bereich, and initiator of the MA program Cultures of the Curatorial at the Academy of Visual Arts in Leipzig. Her research interests are the curatorial, the modes of cultural production connecting theory and practice, the effects of neoliberalism and globalization on the cultural field, and postmodern concepts of the artist. It made more sense to us that Beatrice is here, on the one hand, because of her crucial role in curatorial theory, and especially for her involvement as a co-editor along with Benjamin Meyer-Kramer of Hospitality, Hosting Relations in Exhibitions, the third and last one of Cultures of Curatorial book series. This publication analyzed from the perspective of hospitality the curatorial within the current sociopolitical context through key topics concerning migration, conditions along borders, and accommodation for refugees. The contribution of this volume by international curators, artists, critics, and theoreticians deal with condition of decontextualization and displacement, encounters between the local and the foreign, as well as the satisfaction of basic human needs. Once again, thank you very much, Beatrice, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Diana, for the invitation and for this kind introduction. I will go back and forth a little bit between reading a text and kind of relating back to it in a kind of more loose way. And it will start, as Diana has already announced, from the notion of hospitality. But it gives a very strong bias or focus on the notion of care in this respect. A curatorial situation is always one of hospitality, and this was the observation from where my colleague Benjamin Meyer-Kramer and myself started our project of cultures with the cultures of the curatorial, and which I continued then to pursue for my forthcoming book on the curatorial condition. In this book, I describe hospitality as one of 4 key concepts with which I define the curatorial condition, with aesthetic, economic, political, social, and at least ethical implications. The dispositive of hospitality is what one might want to call the arena in which it is decided whether and how questions of aesthetic experience, of recognition and exclusion, of distribution of resources and generosity, of power and hierarchies, of responsibility, and last but not least, of care, are dealt with in curatorial terms. And this, of course, brings us back to the etymological origin of the term curating, by which I mean the Latin curare, care. And this has been the founding notion of the curatorial profession for a long time, with all its ambivalences, which I won't go into because they have to do with either rather a serving attitude, or on the other hand, rather more meaning productive perspective in it. But in this sense, in the sense of the Latin curare, one might also say that any curatorial situation not only is one of hospitality, but it implies definitely matters of care. For today's talk, however, the curatorial hospitality will be the framework from where I start and from which I will address these matters of care. The curatorial situation is one of hospitality because it implies a range of invitations to all human and non-human participants within that situation, that is artists, artworks, artifacts, curators, designers, critics, individual visitors or different groups, institutions, etc. In this invitation, it also, or by this invitation, it then consequently starts to receive and welcome all these participants. It hosts them for a situation that is temporary. It's unusual, it's not used to by most of the participants, it's unaccustomed surrounding, and it's a moment of transfer that all these participants undergo. Finally, and I think that's maybe the one that's most important for today's context, it operates with the aporia inherent in notions of hospitality, i.e. between unconditionality and legally regulated conditionality, between an unconditional welcoming to everything and everyone is one of the move, and who seeks or needs to everything and everyone who is on the move and who seeks or needs to be hospitably received on the one hand, and on the other hand, the marginalization and exclusion legitimized by rules and regulations in the field. So the term hospitality thus describes the premises and conditions under which the curatorial relations are created, shaped, and modified. And viewed in this way, hospitality can be considered, as I have already mentioned, as a dispositif. And by that I mean the dispositif within which each curatorial constellation acquires specific meaning. A dispositif is eminently ethical by definition, and in this case reflects the aesthetic, social, political, and economic lines of force that run through the curatorial constellation and that are responsible for the shape and impact of its relations. The way curatorial hospitality is played out, the way the aspects of invitation, encounter, offer, and care interact with one another determines the orientation within which the relations between the participants are remade, shaped, altered, and shifted. And again, by these participants, I mean the humans and non-humans at the same time. What becomes obvious is the network created by the dispositif as defined by Foucault, and he defines it between all the elements, that is the discourses, the institutions, the architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic propositions, unquote. This network is tied into entangled relations of power and knowledge, on whose functioning it can in turn exert a shaping influence. The special qualities of the dispositif thus include, as Deleuze expresses in his writing on Foucault, include its ability to transform and update itself. So, what is important for me in this respect and with relation to the definition of the dispositif is that the dispositif not only shapes the relation, but is one that is continuously able to reshape itself and with it the relations within itself. This, I think, is particularly pertinent in relation to the current debates that have not only started with the waves of migration, but particularly in the art field, but also with the increasing mobility quite generally of humans, objects, and information, which is facilitated by transport technologies, digitization, and have been raising questions of foreigners, shelter, and belonging, as well as issues of rights, duties, responsibilities, and protection. In this process of growing mobility, what initially appear as distinct roles of giving and receiving hospitality lose their binding force and prescribed assignability. Both conditions under which hospitality is granted and the roles and tasks that can or must be performed are called into question. In this context, Derrida's appeal for unconditional hospitality acquires added weight, but so do doubts over positions adopted within relations of hospitality that grant power to dictate these relations. The unquestioned nature of these positions and the claims they make come under pressure to justify themselves. And this is relevant for the current situation of museums and exhibiting institutions at the same time, particularly in their relation to the public. This has become rather heated debate. And the quotorial reflects exactly on these changed economic, social, and political demands on hospitality. The possibility to mobilization allows artworks and artifacts to be shipped worldwide for presentation, which goes hand in hand with both increased travel by the associated human actors and new possibilities and procedures for marketing and collecting. The intensification of international exhibition activity, the biennials would be probably the most prominent example of that. So this intensification is part of this development that is creating, if you wish, a new placelessness and restlessness of people and objects in the art field. A stimulus and a threat in equal measure, this dynamic ultimately raises questions about the current social position, justification, and mission of collecting and exhibiting execution, and pushing for a redefinition of mediation, accessibility, participation, and care. What, one might ask, are the premises, conditions, and interests involved in welcoming, facilitating encounters, in making space and time available, in granting residency, in guaranteeing accessibility, giving attention and recognition, and exercising attentiveness as well as care? The cultural dispositif of hospitality is less characterized by individual hospitable practices, which you can find in a variety of initiatives in museums and artistic works. It's, I think, much rather meant to focus on the participation of all of the people involved and the things involved in the curatorial relations that are articulated in and through this dispositif. And due to its close associative connection to generosity, hospitality has at first sight essentially a seemingly positive connotation. It appreciates an attitude that takes into account and upholds the interests of the different groups of guests, visitors, artists, works, which can be traced to the notion of unconditional hospitality, which Derrida, in his writing of hospitality, talks about. This reactivates an open concept of taking in all those, as I said, who are on the move, understood in anthropological terms as a basic right. It existed into the Middle Ages, although this is right into the Middle Ages, although laws at the time began to take shape, and laws that redefined hospitality in terms of the legal treatment of foreigners and strangers. This is increasingly restrictive, state-controlled right to hospitality led to, I quote, the birth of the foreigner, unquote, and the more or less farewell to the guest. The negatively connoted understanding of legally defined hospitality as a form of exclusion derived its legitimacy above all from the unavailability of the guest. The fact that a guest, to qualify as such, is and may only be present temporarily. This transient quality marks the guest as unfixable in space and time. At the same time, guests exist in an exceptional state, not only removed from everyday existence, but also capable of removing others from it. It is this ungraspable quality that makes encounters with the guest uncanny, thus prompting in turn efforts at regulatory control. As a consequence, since the dawn of modernity, if not before, hospitality has been fraught with power relations. To start with, they determine whether hospitality is granted at all, And if so, according to which criteria and under which conditions. They're also responsible for the attribution of identity and status, and related to this, for assigning the available resources. Transferred to the cultural context, this means the definition of the roles, tasks, status, and function that can be performed by all the participants, and the assignment of time and space in the broadest sense. The means and procedures of distribution and definition that are used under the premises of hospitality to counter the unavailability of those who are mobile and only temporarily present cast a new light on the activities traditionally associated with the curatorial, by which I mean selecting, collecting, ordering, conserving, and mediating. Thus underscoring the ambivalence between care and shelter on the one hand, and the, one has to say, normalizing, de-othering effect of subsumption under existing value systems on the other. Taking responsibility in the name of care offers protection, respect, and recognition, but it also dictates the status of those concerned, and thus their degree of having a voice or remaining voicelessness. In the curatorial context, as in the socio-political field, acts of naming and identifying, of categorizing, of classification and valuation are forms of subjection to existing criteria and norms that are used to justify both hierarchization and exclusion. At the same time, whenever they attribute guest status, they also reassert their own status as not guest in relational terms. Which brings us to another notion in relation to hospitality and care, which is the notion of the gift. Which position does this attribution of guest occur from? Who can accept or refuse it, and how? Who benefits? Who is disadvantaged? And what is at stake for the various participants? The significance and implications of these questions unfold along the paradoxical logic of the gift. Inasmuch as the gift is conceived of as being tied to reciprocity, as it is in the anthropological and sociological tradition, the host's openness to the guest is also situated within such a relationship of compensability. In this sense, giving space represents a social obligation that manifests itself in an exchange defined by rules. The formulation of curatorial relations in the interest of public perceptibility is the main gift exchanged within the dispositive of hospitality. Curatorial coming together allows those involved to appear to one another. Opportunities for mutual perception are what is given here. And it is through these opportunities that the coming together of all, humans and non-humans, becomes a curatorial one. The, I quote, insatiable desire for the gaze, unquote, identified by the German philosopher Katrin Busch in her engagement with the gift in relation to images. So this insatiable desire for the gaze also characterizes, to my view, the multilateral relations that arise in the curatorial. This desire, shared not just by work and viewer, but by all those involved, focuses on the effects associated with visibility in the form of presence, mediation, exchange, accessibility, and participation. But they are also linked with expectations of publicity and circulation, evaluation, valorization, and recognition. As part of a mostly veiled economy of symbolic goods, and here I quote Pierre Bourdieu, as part of this economy of symbolic goods, the potential functionalization of this gift, the facilitation of mutual perception, points to its valorizing and evaluating effects on exhibits, display tools, and venues, but also, and not least, on curators, art institutions, or local communities. Visibility, or to become more precise, a different visibility, is the asset that is at stake in the curatorial dispositive of hospitality. And this brings us to the issue of ethics. And as I said, it's kind of an immanent characteristic of the dispositif. Against this background, let us consider the contradictory nature of the immanently ethical dimension addressed by the dispositif of curatorial hospitality. The call, by which I mean the call for an inclusive, generous, and responsible procedure, which is rendered deeply ambivalent in both political and socio-economic terms by the asymmetric generating effects with which it is associated. Within the logic of hospitality, both the unequal starting positions and stakes of those involved and the measures for regulating, framing, and appropriating unavailability constantly risk being obscured by the ethical aspect. However, thanks to the instability created by the provisional status of guest and host, these ambivalences are never fully out of sight, acting as a reminder of the changeability of the conditions within the dispositif. This oscillating between definitional fixing and unfixability involves all of those involved in the situation of hospitality in processes of becoming, and becoming in the course of which tasks, positions, frameworks, and profiles can be defined relationally, dynamically, and with varying attributions. In this light, curatorial caring must be understood as a situational transformative ethos. Mutually becoming each other's guests is the potential inscribed in the curatorial relations of hospitality. This open-endedness means that neither hierarchies and dependencies between participants nor the tasks and functions to be distributed among the individual positions can ever be considered fixed. Just as guests can take on a hosting role, artworks can act as hosts, gifts can transform their object status into that of subjects, and spaces, in the sense of relationally shifting threshold situations, can constantly redefine the relations between inside and outside. Under the premise of the unavailability of the guest, the relations of mutual perception, of production, of reception, and of distribution among the assets at stake are continually reshaped and can thus only ever be defined temporarily. And this brings me to the last aspect of this ethical and political dimension of hospitality. As a result, the focus when dealing with the curatorial dispositif of hospitality is not on identities, but on processes. The way someone or something became, becomes, and acts as a host or guest, the conditions under which the host-guest relationship takes shape as one emerging from history into the present, continually changing, changeable, and performed anew. In this light, the situation of hospitality is emphatically temporalized. The continual reformulation of the temporary relations among humans and non-human actors shapes processes of subjectivation and objectivation, of articulation of claims to ownership and access, of formatting spaces and drawing borders, which in turn determine the different possibilities and modes of participation. They allow not a single scene, but moments of hospitality that can be performed more than once, and to quote Mireille Rosello, at many different levels, among a multitude of actors whose position of power and powerlessness is not only relative, but also disconnected from their identity, unquote. On the basis of such a processualization, the involved practices, tools, and positions can be continuously redistributed, shaping a succession of new relations. Activities like extending a welcome or taking shelter are neither clearly defined in their implications and orientation, nor are they firmly, timelessly, or individually assigned. Instead, they can be performed relationally by many and varied actors, independent of assigned identities. Meaning is generated collectively, and the way particular meanings are foregrounded to cohere as a narrative is temporary and situational as the formulation of the subject positions such as artists, curators, or mediators. Practices of enclosure, appropriation, and privatization compete with practices aiming for accessibility, participation, and commoning. In both symbolic and material terms, this reflects the pivotal moments where paternalization can compete with empathy, individualized administration with collective mobilization, control with release, marketing with recognition, subjugation with care. Regardless of when or how human or non-human participants become guests or hosts within the curatorial dispositif of hospitality, then the relations into which they enter are insecure on account of their temporary status. Remaining apparatic and unfulfillable in its ethical claims, curatorial hospitality has the potential to shape, change, and reframe the conventions, orders, rules, dogmas, and laws that dictate these aesthetic, social, economic, and political relations within the curatorial. If an appeal to a care-grounded responsibility can nonetheless be made within curatorial hospitality in spite of all its ambivalences, then it is in the interest of exactly such renegotiations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Beatrice, for your brilliant and clarifying presentation. I'm looking forward to commenting it in more detail in the debate. And now I would like to introduce Bonaventure Ndikung, who is a curator, author, and biotechnologist. He is the founder and artistic director of Savi Contemporary in Berlin, the artistic director of Sonsbeek 2024, a quadrennial contemporary art exhibition in Arnhem, the Netherlands, and the next director of the Huis der Culturen del Belt. His essays have been included in catalogs for Bamako Encounters, Africa Biennial of Photography, Documenta 14, the Artes Mundi Prize, Centro Atlántico de Arte Moderno, Akban Sanat Istanbul, the Riga International Biennial, Maxi Museo Nazionale delle Arti del XXI Secolo, Museo Tanguely, Fundación Louis Vuitton, and the Contemporary Art Biennial Sex Video Brazil. His recent curatorial projects have been have been shown in international exhibitions such as Marrakesh Biennial Satellite or Biennial of Dakar, and he was the curator at large of Adam Shimshis in Documenta 14. Currently, Bonaventure Ndikung is also a professor in the Special Strategies MA program at the Vicensey Academy of Art in Berlin. And we are convinced that Bonaventure has a great deal to share to this debate, especially due to his brilliant contribution with one of his latest publications, The Delusions of Care, a culmination of 3 long essays that ruminate on notion of care in our contemporary history, and where it is a concert with the appropriation of care by the capitalist establishment as much as supremacists of all kinds. The book does not only point out the pitfalls of a corrupted notion of care, but tries to offer paths to rehabilitation, restoration, and restitution through a non-selfish spirit of care. Thank you very much, Bonaventure, once again for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Diana, for the introduction, and thank you, Beatrice, for your lecture, which I very much appreciate. And I wanted to also say a word of thanks for Beatrice's contribution in the field of curating in the past decades. So she's helped shape the field in which we all work. Listening to Beatrice, I had to think of a project, large-scale exhibition we did several years ago with the title, Whose Land Have I Lit on Now? Contemplations on the Notions of Hospitality. And for that project, we're really looking at the larger relation between hospitality and hostility. And obviously, because we're doing exhibitions and so on, it was important to also situate that within the practice of exhibition making, curating. We're looking at several topics in that project. One had the title, I Guess I Host, Who's the Ghost? Which explored power gradients between hosts, guests, and the becoming of a ghost, the zombifying transformation process between guests and hosts, as well as the violences implicated in these transitions. We're also looking at a chapter titled Forging a Bridge from Wir Schaffen das to Das Boot ist voll, in which we probed a gradual shift of hospitality towards hostility, which was very much the case with the so-called influx of migrants, people in dire need, looking for greener pastures in 2015 that came into the country. And the chancellor at the time said they schaffen das, and there was a very fast shift to hostility, and we're trying to look at those processes. Another chapter was called Caressing the Phantom Limb, Heimat, Progression, Regression, Stagnation, that's a question with a question mark, in which we looked at the power of the notion of Heimat that has come to characterize privileges and the common denominators of those who are viewed by the majority as eligible to partake in the privileges. And the last chapter was Riding the Tide on Hostipi Capitalism, which revisited the notion of hospitality in neoliberal capitalism, which successfully transformed hospitality from virtue into ubiquitous commodity. And I think this was one of the points of departure for the book that became the Delusions of Care, which is a book that I actually wrote because I thought that a lot of the discourses on care were rather delusional, were rather more about the commodification of the notion of care rather than care itself. So I would read from a subsection of the book, but before I go there, I wanted to take some time to give a shout out to a brilliant poet, indigenous Stolo poet who passed on a few weeks ago, called Lee Maracle. And in doing so, I would read a short poem from her collection called Talking to the Diaspora. And I'm reading this because it sets a tone for the curatorial practice we have at Savvy Contemporary, which is the space that is led by 23 people from different parts of the world, which I happen to work. And the poem is titled Maps. And it goes: maps are others marching men to old places already seen. Maps conjure memories of spoil, of plunder and innocence. Maps are journeys to illusions no one has learned from. Maps are critical revisits, visions of never before seen repeats. Maps direct intentions, call attention and expose previous being. Maps scatter reflection and delude well-being. Maps flatten surfaces, time, distance, even height. Reduce critical illusions to trails of ink and color. Maps are pretentious, arrogantly purporting to know where everything is, pretending power where none is. Maps are finite. Maps are always old. Maps never lead to uncharted places. Maps flip our attention from being to place, from metaphysical time to streets, roads, and clocks. Maps cheat our prospective response to depth. So I'm reading this poem not only to honor Lee Maracle, but to set the tone for what we've been doing, trying to rethink concepts. So a curatorial practice based on the redefining of concepts and proposing other concepts, based on remapping, recharting, rethinking cartographies, which is basically what I try to do with this book, The Delusion of Care. So I will read from the section called Act 7, Detecting, Distilling Care in Curating, or the Curatorial. And I'll just read the subsection, so I'll skip a lot, so bear with me. My primary concern stems from what I call the curatorial complex. The curatorial complex is a tendency whereby most or everything is carefully trimmed to fit the orbit of the metaphor. Especially in contemporary independent curating, not only are many a subject that is dealt with metaphorically, also the notion of care as that which is fundamental in curating and curatorial practice tends to be reduced to that realm of the metaphor. This is in no way to say that there is anything problematic about using figures of speech to non-literally relate to things or actions. Quite to the contrary. As we all know that metaphors enrich artistic works, both textually and aesthetically, and in using metaphors, we can simplify and make accessible and comprehensible some very complicated notions. Take, for example, time is money, or the world's a stage. While money and stage aid us significantly to understand the complexity of both time and the world, respectively, it would be absolutely problematic to reduce time only to money and the world only to being a stage. Thus, my first concern of the curatorial complex that reduces care to a metaphor. In an era where curating has come to mean everything and nothing, where curating is reduced to the sheer act of selecting, where curating is a matter of choice and display, Matignon and Rogov's proposal of the curatorial comes in as a welcome expansion of the field and what it can do. And I quote, "If curating is a gamut of professional practices that had to do with setting up exhibitions and other modes of display, then the curatorial operates at a very different level. It explores all that takes place on the stage setup, both intentionally and unintentionally by the curator, and views it as an event of knowledge. So to drive home a distinction between curating and the curatorial means to emphasize a shift from the staging of the event to the actual event itself, its enactment, dramatization, and performance," end of quote. This is of particular interest because by employing the notion of the curatorial, one expands the space of care from selection and display to also encompass enactment, dramatization, and performance. By this, I would like to understand that all events that have been considered extracurricular to curating, like discursive programs, symposia, public programs, performances, reading spaces, and more, are actually crucial components of the exhibition itself, as the artists and topics at stake receive manifold trajectories of exploration. In exploring all that is staged and treating this as an event of knowledge, through varying channels and mediums, provisions are made for the artists, the art, and the themes in terms of presentation, maintenance, cultivation, protection, dissemination, mediation, and other epistemic, moral, and legal considerations that one can call care. Though the curatorial offers a widened space of care for the practice, in thinking about curatorial, I had to think about the debates on creolité versus creolization, not in content or meaning, but in the framework of processualism, and in the relation of the static versus the dynamic embedded in the concepts of creolité versus creolization, respectively. When Mantia Diawara asked Edouard Glissant about creolité aboard the Queen Mary 2 in 2009, Glissant responded that, and I quote, "When you say creolité, you fix its definition of being once and for all in time and place. Now, I think that being is in a state of perpetual change. And what I call creolization is the very sign of that change. In creolization, you can change, you can be with the other. You can change with the other while being yourself. You are not one, you are multiple. And you are yourself. You're not lost because you are multiple. You are not broken apart because you are multiple. Creolité is unaware of this. It becomes another unity like Frenchness, Latinity, etc., etc. That is why for a long time now, I have developed the idea of creolization, which is a permanent process that supersedes historical avatars. End of quote. I'm interested in thinking about curating in a state of perpetual change, in a process, curating as a multiple concept that develops and adjusts self in time and space. With the notion of the curatorial, I see an adjustment in function, but which comes across still as static in space and time. But with what I would like to call curatorialization, I would like to propose the possibility of a curatorial practice that is malleable in form, space, and time, and that in its multiplicity of existences expands the scope of the curatorial practice itself. In this case, instead of understanding the music selection as process of the DJ and the club as an act of curating, one would imagine a curator implementing the structure of the DJ within a process of making an exhibition, which is to say, thinking of the audience of the exhibition as a DJ would think of the dancers on the dance floor. This necessitates a deep understanding of the space, a deep listening of the bodies that occupy the space, and a deep mastery of the way moods change with time across an evening of a DJ set. There is a constant adaptation taking place. As soon as the DJ notices that the floor has come to a standstill, he needs to react. He needs to catch the attention of his dancers and needs to keep them on the move. In using this analogy to exemplify what I mean by curatorialization, I am in no way trying to equate the curator to a DJ, but I am trying to imagine ways of expanding the field of care of the curator's practice, a care for the artist and the art, but also a deep sense of care of the audience at the disposition of the curator. What I am proposing is that besides moving from the act of just displaying staging, to say curating, to enacting, to dramatizing, performing events of knowledge, which is the curatorial, curatorialization would have to also mean employing other strategies that open up cracks and caveats of care that we might not have explored until now, and that constantly adapt themselves to the needs of the artist, art, and audience, as well as times and spaces, and most especially over extended periods of time before and beyond the exhibition itself. Exhibitions are often always conceived as static beings, but it is this thinking of an exhibition and finding ways of vivifying an exhibition, its processes before, during, and after the act, display, staging performances, and symposia that I would like to think of as curatorialization. For those of us that have to carry the burdens of historical disenfranchisement, I would actually like to push that notion of curatorialization to actually also relate to the notion of marronage. In the binary of fight or flight, it is often fight that is considered the active form of resistance. But in the history of slavery, the history of enslavement in the Caribbean and Latin American slave enterprises, for instance, in Barbados, Brazil, Jamaica, or Suriname, but also in the Indian Ocean, for example, in La Réunion, marronage served as a possibility for the enslaved to escape from plantations and create maroon communities in the peripheries of slave enterprises. Be it the petit marronnage, in which people escape for a short period of time to then return, or grand marronnage, in which they escape permanently. At the heart of it all are strategies of resistance, which sometimes led to rebellions across some colonies. In the hideouts, the Maroons could challenge the plantation system by the sheer act of absence, depriving the plantation of its workforce, attacking the plantation or negotiating their freedom and autonomy, but also encouraging or inciting others to follow suit. But what is also fascinating about the act and space of marronage is the ability to retreat, both as a concept of pulling back and also a notion of caring for oneself and your kin. In my proposal of curatorialization as marronage, I would like to imagine a space like Savvy Contemporary in Berlin, Chiasma in Paris, Raw Material Company in Dakar, just to name a few, as spaces of retreating, not as metaphor, to organize, to congregate peoples, knowledges, things we care about and intend to care for. Another example of an effort of extending that space of the curatorial and thereby offering a care beyond the metaphor can be observed in Jonas Stenius's and Sharon MacDonald's paper, The Recursivity of the Curatorial. Irrespective of the historical shortcomings of anthropology as a discipline and problems inherent to the notion and practices of anthropology, it is worth taking a glance at their proposal of the recursivity of the curatorial with regard to the relationship between anthropology and the curatorial practice in the following excerpts. And I can go on and on and on, but I think it's 8 p.m. I could just stop here and we talk. So thank you.
Many thanks, both of you, for such stimulating and brilliant presentations. I think there are many questions that could be asked, but before that, I would like to give you the floor in case you would like to start this debate with some ideas from the presentation of the other guest, Beatrice or Bonaventure.
I mean, I already started with my thoughts on Beatrice's presentation, thinking of hospitality and extending it to Derrida's concept of hospitality and looking at, those two sides of the same coin, where there's hospitality, there could also be hostility. And I'm thinking of that curatorial space as, a space in a slippage, always at the edge, always at the threshold, in which hospitality could be enacted, but also hostility can be enacted, like in every other space, So how do we work with that? So I started by actually mentioning and taking a cue from Beatrice's presentation.
Yeah, and I think I would very much like, thank you, Bonaventure, for this really very stimulating talk. And I also think the book is really a great contribution to the discussions we are having at the moment about institutional curatorial care, what that might possibly be. I very much like your notion of the curatorialization as a process-oriented mode of describing what's happening within the curatorial field if you take process seriously as something that allows for a variety of, as you quoted Jonas Stenius and their book on recursivity, or the text on recursivity. I'm very curious, and I think I would very much like you to perhaps elaborate a little bit on the marronage. Because I like it as a concept. It goes beyond the threshold. It allows for a space existing outside of the and space meant, I understand, in kind of very extend its sense. So it's not just a kind of architectural space or institutional space. It's another form of spatial definition. And I would just like you to elaborate a little bit on that, of what that might be or could be in terms of doing projects within the Cultura.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the question. Maybe one way of elaborating on Marronage would be thinking through the work of somebody like Abdias do Nascimento, who wrote a brilliant book called O Quilombismo, and in which he was talking about the quilombos in Brazil, which were spaces set up by the Maroons, who fled from the plantations and created these structures, in terms of architecture, in terms of governance structures, So if you look at the work of Zumbi dos Palmares, for example, who in the 1600s took over, who actually tried to use governance structures and religious practices from the Congos in Brazil. So what I find very interesting there is that in his proposal of Quilombismo, Abdias do Nascimento actually says that the Quilombos were what he would call, the first spaces of democracy within that space of Brazil. Why did he say that? Because it was one of the first spaces, in the time of enslavement and the industry, the plantation industry. It was one of the few places in which people actually freed themselves and cared for each other. And I'm interested in that, So if you look at it, even in the topography, people fled on the hills and behind the hills. They fled into, I just came back from La Réunion. They fled into the ravin, the crevices. And what is very important there is that these are spaces that one can consider as spaces of darkness, spaces in which you can retreat from the public eye, because being seen is also an act of violence. So retreating to be able to see yourself, to be able to see each other. So that process of accommodation of the eye is very important, So when you turn off the light, you don't see anything, but then after some time, you start seeing. And that space of darkness, you could see each other. But then, even if you don't see each other, you can rely on the people around you, because you don't depend on the sense of sight. You can touch them, you can feel them, you can smell them. So in thinking about this in curatorial practice, I'm trying to imagine a possibility of going beyond that space of just the sight, beyond that space in which, that slippage can happen between hospitality and hostility, but creating a space in which one could, and I don't know if it's possible, Beatrice, and I would like us to talk about this, where one can find a kind of unconditional hospitality, where you depend on each other, a space of interdependence, and this is what we've been trying to do. And again, in that processuality, in that idea of becoming, of never getting there, of striving towards something, we appreciate that process, and each step we try to get better. So I don't know if it really answers your question, but these are my thoughts on Marronage and thoughts on how to possibly get to that space. As you see, because I'm sitting somewhere else, a lot of people are coming in and out. I'm sorry about that. But we're many people in the space, so it's savvy. Yes.
I would like to invite our audience to ask the questions of send any comment on the chat enabled on YouTube. And I would like to comment that I really appreciate the difference suggested by Beatrice between hospitality, affection, and care, even if the curatorship comes from the Latin term curare, that is take of care. The curatorial hospitality that Beatrice proposed to us is like a common space where our relations meet with all their conflicts and ambivalence and paradoxes. And I would like to ask to Beatrice, could hospitality also be a way of getting closer to try to understand those who don't think like us, to those with whom we don't share our ideas?
I think what the idea of hospitality in curatorial terms could offer is very much the modeling of spaces that run counter to the existing conditions in which we currently experience unhospitable attitudes. And I think I'm not sure, maybe you can talk about that when Bonaventure was talking about care and its metaphorical status. I think within the art field, particularly within the curatorial field, we have the option of allowing for situations or constructing situations or inviting to situations in which the multilateral participation and its relationality allows to see other forms of relating to one another. And I think what I'm most interested in is this formation of relations between the participants that are different from the relations that we observe, be they institutional or be they on a kind of very individual or personal level. I think that is one of the potential powers that curatorial work can actually have. And this is exactly why I was asking Bonaventure about the marronnage, because I thought what I think I find stimulating is how does this other space deal with visibility. As you said, it's visible with a different and obscure circumstances, but nevertheless it allows for visibility that then in turn is the fundamental precondition for care. But it's a different mode of coming together in public. There is a public, but it's a different public, and it's a coming together that's a different form of coming together. So yes, I do see that form of relating the current situation.
If I may, Beatrice, I wanted you to talk about, or I would like you to talk about curating as hospitality within maybe state institutions, which have a very high threshold. So there are many people I know in Berlin that won't go into a state museum because they think it's not a space that belongs to them. I remember working on a project at Beaux-Arts in Brussels and talking to a Congolese community in Brussels, and they told me, "Ça c'est un lieu de blanc." You know, they didn't see it as a space, although they pay taxes, although they contribute in the running of that space. They didn't see it as a space that belongs to them. So how does this hospitality and curating actually also become hospitable for such people? You know, how does hospitality act in the changing of the threshold that keeps those people out of such spaces?
Very, very small question.
Sorry.
The solution would not be to include everybody or try to address everybody, because that would be kind of universalizing gesture. I think what you address and what I try to address through this insistence on processes and on temporality and on the performative, I think would allow also for the institution to enter a process of activity, so to speak, a process in which it is remodeling itself continuously in accordance to some of the needs, not to all, but to some of the needs that the institution encounters as being part of the specific community. And I think in that respect, institutions have started to change quite tremendously already. Some of them have not, many of them have not, but I think this idea of being an institution that is paid for by governmental money or state money, and nevertheless only addresses a very small part of the community that actually paid for it. I think that is a problem which I actually meant when I said the crisis of museums and exhibitionary institutions. And I think this kind of instituting an institution, continuously kind of defining itself through the processes of relating to the potential audiences, is maybe one way of understanding an institution in a different way. Yeah, I think that would be a preliminary answer.
Okay, thank you very much. You're on mute, Diana.
We can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you very much. And we have an interesting question, comment. It is very long. It's from Oriol Fondevila. And he said, many thanks to both of you. The tension between hospitality and hostility is brilliant to understand the work of the curatorial as a mediation work. Even though museums or art centers usually keep isolated the way to produce artistic value and the ways to produce, let's say, social value, my impression is the hostility that can introduce unexpected audience in the museum are so often set apart of the apparatus of production of the artistic value. So, although art centers are making steps further to open structures to otherness, the ways to produce artistic values are safe too much often a part of the potential hostility. Would you agree with this impression, in which extent the discourse of caring offers alternative ways to rethinking the production of art value in the art world? This is the common question of Oriol Fondevila, who is a member of the Crítica Association of Catalonia. I don't know if you have some impression of some answer.
Can you please post the comment or question in the commentary in the comment section, in the chat section?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
of course. And I don't know if we have other question of the audience. But regarding the Bonaventure's presentation, I would like to ask you, what role do you think contemporary art plays in established capitalism? So, what role does the museum play in it? And if do you think there are spaces like Savvy more predisposed to rethinking the maps of the curatorial, maybe independent space and
yes, I think that's what we're trying to do, to rethink the map of the curatorial. That's why I read Lee Maracla's map, to engage with the different, I would say, violences of the past and the present, and rethink, ways of being in the world. Now, I don't want to be too fast at claiming, not being part of a capitalist mechanism, because that's too easy to say, but we have to be honest about things. Despite all efforts, we do play a part in that process, So we're all a part of that system. As much as you try to be out of it, sometimes it's even smarter than us. But what I know we do is that in the past 12 years, we've tried to, from this space we find ourselves, called Berlin, try to rethink what it means to make exhibitions, And I'll just give an example. If you look at the project we did on ultrasanity, which is a project we started in Venice on the island on San Sevolo, thinking about madness, and we call it ultrasanity because in English you say insanity, which is which purports that somebody in that space is the opposite of sanity, but we don't necessarily want to just agree with that. We want to think of other ways. So we call it ultrasanity, to be able to think of other ways in being in this world. So the first iteration in Venice on the island of San Sevolo was to think about, in a psychiatric home, because San Sevolo was historically this place in which, the so-called mad in society were sent to. So we wanted to work there. The second iteration was happening in Essaouira in Morocco, which is the capital of Gnawa. That's where the Gnawa festival happens. And what was very important there is that historically people have traveled from all over the world to go to Essaouira to get healed. People that were in mental distress to get healed through the music. So Gnawa was a possibility, an alternative to, medicine that comes from the pharmaceutical industry. The third iteration was in Lubumbashi in Congo, in which we're looking at the relationship between sanity and sanitation, taking Sami Baloji's work of the cordon sanitaire as a point of departure, where, the city was divided into two parts, the so-called clean, which were the Europeans on one side, and the so-called unclean on the other side, so we're thinking about sanity and sanitation there before coming to Berlin. So in this process, going from one geographical and cultural space to another, going from one chapter to another, inviting people from different walks of life. In Congo, we're working with miners, we're working with artists, and so on and so forth. We're trying to rethink what it means, to do curatorial practice. Now, I don't know if that just falls within the capitalist system, if that is really the question. I think we're trying to exist from this space and out of this space, you know, in that multiplicity which Bisson talks about when he talks about creolization in opposition to creolity, you know. So I think that is what we're really interested in.
Thank you. And I would, in seeking strategies against often unrepresented groups, could we run the risk of a paternalistic cultural policies, of course? And could you mention, Beatrice or Bonaventure, regarding your wide background in curatorial field, some concrete ways to avoid?
I mean, I could mention a concrete example that I appreciated very much, but which is, for example, Maria Lind's Tenster Museum project, which I think worked in a way which I would call a caring for relations and for a specific mode of building relations. And I think that is what I'm referring to with the curatorial care. If we care for the relations more than for the individual parts that are related to one another, I think we allow also for a relativization of the position of the curator and its authority and its potential paternalistic way of relating to everybody else. And I think then at least the potential is there of all of the non-human participants to enter into a new mode of being together on that within that situation. But quite generally, I think, and I think also the question maybe that you post in the chat, where I only see the second half now, is concerned by this idea of caring for relations. And in this case, it would be the relation between the institution and its audience that we have addressed already before, but it would also relate to the relation between valorizing and publicizing modes. It would relate to the relation of processes of instituting and institutionalization in order to look at the fundamental preconditions that have formed these relations, and that from there see in which way one might actually modify or rewrite or restructure these relations.
Thank you.
So I'm trying to understand the question you posted in the chat, you know, which was asked by this.
It's a very long question.
Yes.
Yeah, I know.
You know, he's talking about rethinking the production of art value in the art world and care. You know, again, which is a broad thing, and I'm also, there's a part where he talks about open structures to otherness and ways of producing artistic value. And I'm really interested in that. I'm kind of concerned with that, you know. So how do we create institutions in which we are not just caring for some and not for others, and neither caring for just the other? Is something that I'm concerned with. but thinking of the institutions we create, you know, or thinking of instituting as also as a process, and saying that the institutions we create are reflective of the societies we find ourselves in, and reflective of the multiplicity in the societies we find ourselves in. So if we go back to Glissant, and you know, when he writes about the fact that there are no relations without differences, how can we create spaces in which differences are appreciated, in which differences are manifested, spaces in which we're not caring for monochromatic, monolithic structures, but a polychromatic structure, which are the societies in which we find ourselves. And I think in thinking that way, the artistic production is also informed by that, you know, based on the kind of people we invite, the kind of themes we talk about. Do we have the luxury to make a program for the next 5 years, or are we also responding to the socio-political urgencies and agencies within which we find ourselves? I think that is something I'm very interested in, you know. So not only wanting to be reactionary, but being responsive to the socio-political moment, right? And that's something I'm interested in. I don't know if it really answers his question, but I think this is the way I understand it, and this is how I can answer to it.
Thank you very much. Yes. And we could also speak in terms of affective capitalism too. So, yeah, it's a problematic topic. I don't know if Beatrice would say any more.
With regards to?
It seems that we don't have any more questions. So if you want, we say goodbye now, not before. Thanking very, very, very much for this great session to the guest.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us and for these brilliant presentations. And so we could say goodbye and muchas gracias. Nos vemos en la próxima sesión programada para el próximo 14 de diciembre a la misma hora y por el mismo canal, donde contaremos con la conversación entre la escritora Juana Dolores y el equipo editorial de Consoni. Muchas gracias también a Roc Domingo, que ha estado detrás de la sesión con el soporte técnico, a las invitadas y fins aviat. Bona nit.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Bye.